Settle in if you can, and let the day begin to soften around you. Let the smaller noises of the evening drift away, and allow your thoughts to grow a little slower, a little lighter. Tonight we are spending time with ancient Egypt, and with some of the stranger facts that gathered around its burial customs, its tombs, its names for the afterlife, and the careful objects people placed beside the dead. It is a topic that can feel both grand and intimate because it begins with kings and temples, but it also reaches into ordinary human hopes, ordinary human fears. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, you may like, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment about where you are listening from tonight, or what corner of the past you would like to visit next. Only if that feels pleasant to you. For now, there is no rush at all. The lamps are low, the desert air is still, and the river has long since moved through its evening silence. We can begin slowly with the old stones, the painted walls, and the small, careful customs that try to keep a person safe beyond the edge of one life and into the next. When people think of ancient Egypt, they often picture gold masks, tall monuments, and names carved in stone. But much of the world they built was not meant to impress the living first. It was meant to guide the dead. That idea may sound solemn, but in Egypt it was also practical. A tomb was not only a resting place, it was a home, a map, a sealed promise. The body needed shelter, the name needed protection, the spirit needed directions. Nothing was left entirely to chance. The ancient Egyptians believed that a person was made of many parts. There was the body, of course, but also the ka, a kind of life force, and the ba, often imagined as a mobile soul that could move between worlds. These ideas were not abstract decorations. They shaped the way people lived, prepared, prayed, and buried their dead. A tomb might hold food, furniture, jewelry, tools, and tiny offerings carved from stone or made from painted wood. Even a small figure could matter. If the dead could not gather food themselves, something else had to stand in for them. If work was needed in the next world, little servant figurines might be placed nearby to do it. One of the strangest and most comforting facts is that so many burial objects were made for ordinary use, but in miniature. Little beds, little jars, little boats, little loaves of bread. The next world in the Egyptian imagination was not a place where one simply floated away. It was a place where familiar things still mattered, and so the tomb became a carefully arranged threshold. It was quiet but never empty. It held memory in objects and hope in symbols, and a kind of patient trust that the dead still needed attention. That attention began long before burial. The body itself had to be preserved with great care because the body and the soul were linked. The art of mummification grew from that simple and serious concern. To keep someone whole, one had to keep the body recognizable. The face, the shape, the form, the name written on stone, all of it worked together. The process took time. It involved washing, drying, wrapping, and ceremony. The organs were removed and stored carefully in canopic jars, each associated with protective deities. This is one of those details that can sound severe when stated quickly, yet in context it was a deeply respectful act. The Egyptians were not trying to erase death. They were trying to manage it, to place it in order, to give it a structure that the living could bear. And death in Egypt was never quite separated from life. The river still flooded. The field still grew. The sun still moved across the sky. Daily life itself suggested a cycle of disappearance and return. The sun could sink and rise again. The Nile could retreat and come back. In that world, resurrection was not absurd. It was patterned into the landscape. That may be one reason Egyptian burial culture feels so enduring. It is surrounded by stone, but it is built from repeated observations. The world changes and then it returns. The body sleeps and then perhaps it wakes. The name is spoken and then perhaps it lives again in memory. There is something hauntingly calm about that logic, not cheerful exactly but steady. A culture can be frightened by death and still meet that fear with method. It can love the dead enough to build rooms for them and write names for them and leave them bread and beer and amulets shaped like beetles. The scarab beetle, in fact, became one of the most familiar protective symbols in Egypt. It was linked to the sun's movement and to rebirth. A small beetle rolling a ball of dung across the ground became, in religious imagination, a picture of the sun moving through the sky. From that simple creature, a whole language of renewal was drawn, and that is one of the quieter wonders of ancient Egypt. So many of its symbols came from ordinary life, yet each one was lifted into ritual. A reed, a beetle, a bird, a river crossing, a rower's motion, the gleam of a bead in the sun. Nothing had to be grand in order to become sacred. Tombs were sealed, but they were also addressed. Names were spoken for the dead. Offerings were made. Prayers were repeated. The living returned to the boundary of stone and tried, in their own careful way, to keep conversation open with what lay beyond it. Some tombs were simple, others were vast. A small family burial might be tucked into the earth with minimal ceremony, while a royal tomb might involve architects, labourers, painters, priests, and long planning. But the underlying idea was similar. The dead were not to be abandoned. This can feel strange to modern listeners because many of us imagine death as a hard line. Ancient Egyptians treated it more like a passage, though one that required constant maintenance. A passage can be crossed, but only if it is marked, only if it is understood, only if someone remembers the route. So in a very real sense, the tomb was a piece of writing. It said, here was a person, here is their name, here are the things they will need, here are the words that guard the way, here is the calm order we have made against forgetting. And perhaps that is why these facts still hold us now, because beneath the gold and the carvings and the sand there is a deeply human wish to remain known, to remain safe, to be carried gently through the dark. It is easy to imagine mummies as a single image, wrapped tightly in linen and left in a dark chamber. Yet the reality was far more deliberate and far more varied. Mummification changed over time, and it was not available to everyone in the same way. The wealthiest burials could be elaborate, while others were far more modest. Still, the central impulse remained: preserve the body and preserve identity with it. The removed organs were treated with special care. The heart often remained in the body because it was linked to thought, memory, and judgment. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were placed in canopic jars, guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. These jars were not mere containers. They were part of a protective system, both practical and spiritual. There is something quietly moving about that combination. The ancient Egyptians were not separate from material reality. They handled bodies, resin, linen, salt, and oil. They understood the physical fact of decay, and yet they surrounded that fact with divine guardians, with patterned language, with ritual order. The wrappings themselves could become symbolic. Layers of linen covered the body with a sense of care that seems almost domestic, as if the dead were being tucked in for a very long journey. Amulets were sometimes placed between the layers. A heart scarab might be included to help the heart remain favorable during judgment. An Eye of Horus amulet might offer protection. Each object was small, but none was casual. Even the use of color in burial goods mattered. Gold suggested the flesh of the gods, or something incorruptible and bright. Blue could evoke the heavens or the Nile. Green suggested renewal, growth, and restored life. The dead were not merely hidden away, they were dressed for a transformed existence. One unusual fact is how much care was given to tomb art as a form of functioning reality. Scenes painted on walls were not just decoration, they could act as provisions. An image of bread might become bread in a magical sense. A painted field might help the dead continue to receive grain. A drawn boat might help the spirit travel. This idea may seem remote now, but it appears in many ancient cultures in different forms. In Egypt, it became especially refined. Image and object, word and power, picture and function, all were closely linked. That is why tomb walls can feel so alive even after so many centuries. They are not empty images. They are instructions, hopes, offerings, and reminders. They say the same thing in many ways. May this person continue. There were also small figurines called ushapti. These little figures were often placed in tombs to perform labor in the afterlife on behalf of the dead. The notion is almost gentle in its own way. Instead of endless work after death, one might have a small painted helper to answer the call. For a culture that cared so deeply about order, this made sense. The afterlife was not a vague mist. It had tasks, it had fields, it had offerings, it had judgment, it had protection. The dead were expected to remain active but not alone. And then there was the question of the tomb itself. Some tombs were hidden in cliffs, others were built into visible monuments, some were cut deep underground. Others were more accessible. The choice of burial place could depend on rank, belief, geography, and time period. Yet across these differences, secrecy often mattered. Many tombs were intended to resist disturbance. Their chambers were sealed. Their passages were misleading. Their entrances might be hidden or disguised. This was not always because the Egyptians loved mystery for its own sake. It was because burial goods were valuable and because the dead needed peace. The irony, of course, is that the hidden tombs became among the most famous places in human history once they were rediscovered. But in their own time, concealment was a form of care. Ancient Egyptians also wrote extensive funerary texts. Some of the best known are the coffin texts and later the Book of the Dead. These were not books in the modern sense, but collections of spells, prayers, and instructions. They helped the dead navigate dangers, speak names, pass gates, and answer questions in the next world. Many spells were beautifully specific. They might protect against snakes, false doors, hungry beings, or confusion. They reveal a world in which the afterlife was not a single cloud-like place, but a landscape of tests and thresholds. And yet, despite the seriousness, there is often a calm intelligence in these texts. They do not panic, they instruct, they name, they prepare. They assume that words matter and that knowing the proper phrase can make a difference. There is a quiet dignity in that belief. It says that even after death, one is not helpless. One can be equipped, one can be guided, one can be answered for. The ancient Egyptians spent centuries refining these customs, adjusting them, and expanding them. What began as local practices became a sophisticated funerary tradition that touched every layer of society. Royal burials drew the most attention, but the same human longing was present everywhere. A person dies and someone nearby wants to keep them safe. That wish, simple as it is, can build entire civilizations of ritual. So when we look at mummies, jars, amulets, and painted tomb walls, we are not only looking at death, we are looking at a very patient form of love, one that tried to remain useful after the final breath. And in the stillness of that idea, there is something unexpectedly soft. The dead were wrapped, the name was spoken, the objects were placed. The way forward was marked. The night was not left entirely unguarded. Among the more famous ideas in ancient Egyptian religion is the judgment of the dead, often imagined as the weighing of the heart. It is a scene that has traveled through history because it is both beautiful and unsettling. The heart in Egyptian thought was more than an organ. It was the seat of memory, character, and inner truth. In the afterlife, it might be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and right order. That image alone can hold the attention for a long time. One small feather on one side, one human heart on the other. Not a trial of noise, but a trial of balance. The deceased would have to pass through this judgment with knowledge and composure. Spells could help, proper preparation could help, a life lived in accordance with order could help, but the idea remains slightly intimidating even now. It is not enough to be buried well. One must also be ready to speak, to remember, to remain steady. If the heart was found too heavy with wrongdoing, the result could be very serious. The creature often associated with the outcome was Ammit, a composite being with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. This was not a goddess of comfort. It was a devourer, a reminder that moral disorder had consequences. Yet even this aspect of Egyptian religion was not only about fear, it was about alignment. The world should fit together properly. Truth should be lighter than falsehood. A person's inner life should not be burdened by distortion. That emphasis on order helps explain much of Egyptian ritual. What looked strange from the outside often served a simple purpose: keep the world in balance, and balance was not an abstract ideal. It was connected to the Nile's flooding, to harvests, to kingship, to temple ceremony, to the movement of the sun. If the sun rose, if the river flowed, if the crop grew, then the cosmic structure still held. This is part of why the Egyptians cared so deeply about divine kingship. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler. He was a central figure in maintaining order. His duties were tied to gods, temples, and the proper functioning of the world. That role could appear terrifying in its responsibility. A king had to sustain rituals that supported the land itself. If we picture ancient Egypt through that lens, the monuments begin to seem less like pride and more like endurance. They were attempts to make stability visible. In the judgment scene, the dead often speak declarations of innocence. These are sometimes called negative confessions, though they are not always simple denials. They are statements that one has not committed specific wrongs, from theft and murder to deceit and disruption. The list can feel severe, but it also gives us a window into values. People feared disorder, yes, but they also prized restraint, honesty, and proper behavior. Burial and morality were intertwined. To die well was to be ready in more than one sense. The funerary texts could be quite practical in tone. They told the deceased how to behave, what to say, whom to address, and how to move through gates guarded by divine beings. Some passages read almost like a map for a difficult night journey. There were also underworld regions, lakes of fire in some traditions, lakes of water in others, gates with guardians who had to be named correctly. This made the afterlife feel less like a single destination and more like a sequence of controlled passages. It is easy to hear that as dark. But ancient Egyptians seem to have understood it as orderly. Every gate had a name, every being had a title, every obstacle could in principle be addressed. That faith in names is important. To know the true name of a thing was to hold some power over it. Thus, writing became a form of protection. Speech became a form of shelter. Even silence had its place, but so did the right phrase at the right moment. One of the most remarkable tomb texts is the Book of the Dead, which continued to change over time and was adapted for different burials. Scrolls were custom-made. Spells were selected. Names were inserted. The text became personal, almost intimate, even while speaking to vast cosmic questions. This is one reason ancient Egypt still feels so close to modern curiosity. The material is remote, but the concern is familiar. What happens after death? How do we remain ourselves? How do we face judgment, whether divine or remembered? The Egyptians answered through ritual, through language, through images painted on walls in quiet chambers beneath the earth. They imagined the soul traveling, speaking, remembering, and surviving the crossing. And in that imagination there is a kind of relief, not because the path is easy, but because it is not empty. It has guides, it has rules, it has companions. Even a monster has a shape and a name. That may be one of the strangest comforts in all of history. The dark is not nothing, it is structured. The unknown is not beyond all thought. It can be approached step by step, phrase by phrase, breath by breath. So when the heart is weighed, it is not simply condemned or spared. It is seen. And being seen in a world of old stone and careful burial might have been the deepest hope of all. One of the most famous burial landscapes in the ancient world is the Valley of the Kings, a place whose name alone suggests depth and removal. It lies on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, where the sun sets, and that setting mattered symbolically. The west was associated with the dead because it was where the sun disappeared each evening. Burial placed the deceased in a landscape already aligned with that daily vanishing. The tombs there were not all the same. Some are small, some extensive, some painted, some more austere. But many were built with an awareness that they might be entered only rarely, and perhaps not at all after sealing. The architecture often descends, turning inward and downward, as if the tomb were a sentence written into stone. The most famous example, of course, is the tomb of Tutankhamun, not because it was the largest, but because it survived with much of its treasure intact. Its discovery brought the world face to face with the density of Egyptian burial practice. Furniture, jewelry, chests, statues, Shabti figures, ceremonial items, and countless details crowded the chamber. But it is worth remembering that this astonishing preservation was unusual. Many tombs were robbed long before modern excavation. Some were opened in antiquity. Others were damaged by water, collapse, or repeated human intrusion. The surviving evidence is therefore a mixture of endurance and loss, and that mixture gives the valley its quiet power. Even in ruin, the place still feels purposeful. The walls are often painted with scenes from the underworld. The corridors may be decorated with stars, deities, serpents, boats, and protective inscriptions. The tomb is not empty architecture. It is an active environment of symbols. What is perhaps most striking is how much effort went into creating a place the living were not meant to inhabit. The dead required labor from the living, and that labor could be very elaborate. Quarrying, carving, painting, inscribing, carrying, sealing, guarding. A tomb could represent years of attention. The workers who built these tombs lived nearby in communities of their own. One famous site, Deir el-Medina, housed artisans responsible for royal tomb work. They were skilled, organized, and in many cases literate enough to leave records that help modern historians understand their daily lives. These records are a quiet treasure. They show that behind the grandeur of kingship was a working population of masons, scribes, plasterers, painters, and labourers who had to be fed, paid, and coordinated. The world of the dead was built by the living, one measured cut at a time. Some of the tomb paintings are beautiful in a way that still feels fresh. Figures step in profile with careful lines. Pigments remain vivid in sheltered chambers. Blues and golds survive where sunlight never reached. It is as though the tomb tried to freeze a particular kind of evening, one without wind. There is also the matter of tomb theft, which was common enough that ancient officials worried about it in legal documents. The idea of hidden riches naturally attracted thieves. Yet the act of robbery was more than theft of objects. It was a violation of sacred order. To disturb the dead was to disturb a compact with the gods. That is one reason tomb protection could be so serious. Guards, seals, and curses were not simply theatrical. They were part of a social and spiritual attempt to keep the burial intact. Even the placement of tombs could reflect that concern. Remote valleys, steep cliffs, concealed entrances, and difficult paths all helped protect what lay inside. The landscape itself became part of the defense. When modern people visit those tombs, they often feel a strange duality. The spaces are ancient, but the engineering is clear. The paintings are remote, but the human hand is visible. The dead seem distant, and yet their concerns are very understandable. They wanted continuity. They wanted names to survive. They wanted offerings to continue. They wanted the body to endure long enough for the spirit to return. And so they built downward into silence with enormous patience. There is no need to rush through that landscape, even in thought. It can be enough to imagine a narrow corridor, dust settled on stone, a painted goddess watching from the wall, and somewhere beyond that, a chamber arranged with care for a person who hoped not to be entirely gone. Not all of ancient Egypt's burial customs belonged to kings, priests, or the richest households. Memory in some form touched everyone. Even modest burials could include amulets, simple offerings, or carefully chosen goods. The ancient Egyptian emphasis on remembrance is one of the most quietly powerful features of the culture. Names were important enough to be written in durable forms. Stone stele preserved identity. Funerary chants could be repeated. Families brought offerings to tombs to maintain a connection with their dead. There was often a practical side to this too. A tomb might stand near family land. A burial place might become a focus for continued devotion. The living did not always think of the dead as gone in the absolute sense. They remained participants in family life, though in a different register. This relationship may have been maintained through food and drink offerings, spoken prayers, and occasional visits. Even when the body lay far beneath the earth, the bond itself could remain above it. One subtle fact about Egyptian religion is how much it blended personal and cosmic concern. A family might care for an ancestor's tomb because the ancestor mattered emotionally, but also because proper burial reflected the order of the world. A dead relative was not only a loved one, they were a being whose condition could affect the balance of things. That may sound heavy, but to the Egyptians it was part of normal life. Ritual did not float above the everyday. It lived alongside work, harvest, childbirth, illness, marriage, and grief. Amulets are a good example. They were small enough to fit in the hand, yet they were deeply serious. Some protected the wearer. Some helped in the tomb. Some invoked divine favor. Small objects in a society of symbols carried large weight. The Eye of Horus, the Ankh, the Jed pillar, the scarab, the knot of Isis. These symbols appeared in jewelry, wall paintings, coffins, and burial equipment. Each had a layered meaning, and people did not need to reduce them to one simple definition in order to trust them. There is a peaceful kind of complexity in that. A symbol could mean protection, regeneration, strength, stability, or life all at once. Ancient Egyptians were comfortable with overlapping meanings because their world was full of overlapping forces. The Nile rose, but not always at the same time. The sun moved, but not without rhythm. The body decayed, but could be preserved. A name could be spoken by the living and heard in some sense by the dead. Everything was in motion, and yet much of it was also cyclical. That cyclical understanding probably helped make death less final in the imagination. Finality was never the only model available. There was the sun's return. There was the field's renewal after flood. There was the memory of the dead, renewed through speech and offering. This helps explain why the ancient Egyptians spent so much energy on tomb inscriptions. A name carved into stone lasts far beyond ink on papyrus. An image painted in a hidden chamber can survive centuries without light. The wall itself becomes a kind of memory device, and because so many of these spaces remained closed for long periods, they preserved not only art but also atmosphere. The silence of a tomb is not an accident, it is part of the intention. The dead were meant to rest, but also to remain accessible to proper ritual. Some tombs had shafts, false doors, and chambers arranged with symbolic architecture. A false door was not a joke or a deception in the modern sense. It represented a boundary through which offerings or spirit presence could pass. It was a threshold made visible. The Egyptians were exceptionally good at thresholds. They understood that crossing matters. A doorway, a river, a gate, a passage, a wrapping, a veil, a seal. Each one marked a shift from one condition to another. That may be why burial remains such a resonant theme in their culture. It is all about transition, but transition managed with care. The dead should not wander. The living should not forget. The gods should be addressed correctly. The world should continue in its proper shape. And if that sounds like a great deal of effort, it was. But effort itself was part of devotion. A carefully prepared tomb was a visible sign that the person inside still mattered. That might be the quietest truth running through so much of ancient Egyptian burial practice. The dead were expensive to remember, and so they were remembered with precision. In that precision there is a tenderness that does not need to speak loudly. A linen wrap, a spoken name, a jar sealed beside the body, a painted boat on a wall, a small figure placed near the feet, all of it saying in its own restrained way, you are not alone. Burial customs are only one part of the larger Egyptian concern with the unseen world. Temples and priestly ritual formed another, equally important layer. Priests were not always secluded philosophers. They were often part of a highly organized system of service. Their duties involved maintaining shrines, presenting offerings to the gods, reciting formulas, and preserving sacred spaces from impurity. In this sense, their work resembled the work done for the dead. Both were forms of maintenance. A temple could be lively at certain times and sealed at others. Sacred statues might be washed, clothed, fed symbolically, and addressed in a precise sequence of actions. These routines were not accidental embellishments. They were believed to sustain divine presence. The Egyptians seem to have understood power as something that required attention. A god was not simply present in a loose way. Presence had to be renewed, tended, and enacted through the proper rites. That same logic extended to burial. The dead, the gods, the king, and the land all depended on proper relationship. Routine became a spiritual technology. There is something soothing in routine when it is viewed this way. Not as drudgery, but as alignment, morning rites, offering bread, pouring water, speaking the name, sweeping the floor, cleaning the image, repeating the gesture until order feels stable again. In temple settings, purity mattered greatly. Priests might bathe, shave, wear linen, and avoid certain foods or behaviors before entering sacred zones. These boundaries helped distinguish the ordinary from the consecrated. Egyptian religion was not shy about material detail. Water mattered, linen mattered, incense mattered, sound mattered. The smell of resins and oils, the gleam of polished surfaces, the rhythm of spoken words, all of it shaped the sacred atmosphere. This attention to sensory order may have made burial customs feel less frightening to those who practiced them. The same kinds of offerings, the same careful speech, the same sense of right procedure could appear in temple ritual and in funerary ritual. The afterlife was not wholly separate from the rest of religion. It was an extension of it. One particularly interesting fact is how much temple and tomb imagery overlap. The dead are sometimes shown receiving offerings in ways that resemble divine reception. This suggests that status in the afterlife could mirror sacred relationship. To be honored properly was to remain within the community of power, even beyond death. The priestly class also helped preserve knowledge, though not in the modern academic sense. Scribes copied texts, priests transmitted formulas, and trained specialists maintained calendars and ritual sequences. Their world was built on repetition, but repetition was not sameness. It was accuracy. Imagine the care required to preserve a sacred text over generations. One wrong sign, one forgotten phrase, and the meaning could shift. For a culture that invested meaning in words, this mattered immensely. Their writing system itself, hieroglyphs, added to the sense of symbolic weight. These were not merely letters in the modern sense, though they could function phonetically. They were also pictures, signs, and carriers of layered meaning. A carved bird, eye, reed, or hand could be language and image at once. This gives Egyptian inscriptions a calm visual richness. A wall covered in hieroglyphs can feel alive even before one reads it. The signs seem to breathe slowly in stone. There is, too, the reality that priests and scribes worked within a social order. They were part of administration, taxation, land management, and redistribution. Sacred routine and civil routine were not always easily separated. In ancient Egypt, the temple could be economic as well as spiritual. That practical dimension is worth keeping in mind because it grounds the more mysterious elements. Egypt was not a place of pure symbolism floating above daily life. It was a working civilization with harvests to track, offerings to store, and labor to manage. The dead were remembered within a functioning society, and perhaps that is why the burial tradition endured so long. It was not a brief spiritual trend. It was woven into administration, theology, family devotion, and the physical landscape of the Nile Valley. The rituals could be solemn, but they also gave structure. Structure can feel reassuring in the deep evening hours. A repeated action, a known phrase, a measured step through a sacred doorway. The world becomes more understandable when it is cared for in the same way each day. Ancient Egypt seems to have believed that the dead, the gods, and the land all appreciated that kind of care. And in a way, it is easy to see why. When life is uncertain, the old routines become a kind of shelter. Among the most enduring elements of ancient Egyptian burial culture are the written spells that accompany the dead. These texts are often discussed in modern summaries, but their original atmosphere was probably quieter and more personal than we imagine. A funerary text was not just a relic, it was a tool. It could be copied onto a coffin, written on a papyrus scroll, or inscribed on tomb walls. The words were chosen with intention and their placement mattered. The Book of the Dead is perhaps the best-known collection, though the title can make it sound more fixed than it was. In truth, it was a flexible body of spells that varied by period and by individual burial. Some versions were elaborate, others more selective. The text was customized, as if each person needed a tailored path. This personalization is fascinating. Even in a culture of strong ritual order, the dead were not entirely treated as interchangeable. Their names could be inserted, their needs could be addressed, their journey could be prepared in a way that felt specific. Many spells were concerned with not forgetting one's name. That detail alone is deeply human. To lose one's name was to risk losing one's place in the world. To be named correctly was to continue existing in a recognizably human form. There were also spells for transformation. The deceased might become a falcon, a lotus, a serpent, a heron, or a luminous being in order to move safely through the afterlife. Transformation was not viewed as a loss of identity, but as one of its possible conditions. That flexibility helped shape Egyptian religion into something rich rather than rigid. A person might remain themselves and also participate in larger cosmic patterns. They could be individual and symbolic at once. The power of names extended to gods and guardians too. If a doorway guardian was named, it could perhaps be passed. If a dangerous force was known, it could perhaps be addressed. Knowledge was protection. Speech was navigation. This gives the whole burial tradition a literary character. The tomb is not just architecture, it is a textual environment. Words on walls, words on coffins, words on papyrus, words repeated by priests. The dead were sent into the next world with a vocabulary. Some passages ask questions, others offer answers. Some identify the deceased as pure, rightful, and prepared. Some declare that the person knows the way. The language is often dignified, yet it still reflects concern. There are obstacles and therefore there are instructions. We often think of ancient spells as dramatic or wild, but many Egyptian formulas feel careful, almost administrative. They list, define, authorize, and protect. They make the unseen world legible. That may be one reason they survive so well in memory. Even if we no longer share the exact beliefs, we recognize the feeling behind them. The wish to be prepared, the wish not to be lost, the wish to have the right words when the time comes. There is also a beautiful tension in the idea that writing itself could preserve the dead. A name in ink can outlast a voice. A line of text can remain after everyone who spoke it is gone. The Egyptians understood this with unusual clarity. They carved names on stone for the same reason they embalmed bodies, because persistence matters. One form of survival was physical, another was textual, another was spoken remembrance. Together, these formed a layered defense against disappearance. Modern readers sometimes approach these spells as curiosities, but for the people who made them, they were serious companions. A scroll placed with a body was a kind of escort. A formula was a kind of lamp. A well-chosen name was a kind of door opening. And so, in the quiet of a tomb, words did not merely describe the journey. They helped create it. That is a very old and very gentle idea. To speak is to shape the dark. To remember is to keep a path clear. To write a name is to leave a small beacon behind. Some of the facts that surround ancient Egypt are not frightening in a loud sense. They are unsettling because they reveal how carefully the ancient world watched the boundary between life and death. For example, tombs could remain sealed for long periods, sometimes so long that the original context survived in remarkable condition. Yet when opened, they could also reveal the fragile evidence of time at work. Broken seals, dust layers, faded paint, disrupted goods. The contrast is striking. Protection and loss exist in the same chamber. Another quiet fact is that many funerary objects were not made of precious materials at all. Wood, faience, plaster, linen, and clay often carried the same symbolic labor as gold or stone. In a culture of ritual purpose, material worth was not always the main question. Function and meaning could matter more than cost. Some coffins were decorated with texts so dense that they formed a visual field as much as a readable document. To stand near one of these coffins is to see language becoming ornament, and ornament becoming protection. There were also very human concerns around the decay of the body. Mummification was partly an answer to the fact that flesh changes. It was an attempt to keep a recognizable form intact long enough for the soul to return. That alone can feel poignant. A person should remain findable. The ancient Egyptians even took great care with names of the dead that might otherwise vanish. If a name was erased, memory could weaken. If memory weakened, so might a person's continued existence in the afterlife. This gave inscription a nearly moral value. Then there are the animals. Cats, falcons, jackals, ibises, crocodiles, bulls, scarabs. Some became sacred, some became symbols. Some were associated with gods or protective forces. The natural world was full of signs, and those signs could be read. This can feel uncanny to modern eyes because the line between animal observation and religious meaning was so fluid, but perhaps that is part of what made Egyptian religion so rich. It watched the world closely. The afterlife itself was imagined in many forms over a long period. It was not a fixed, one-time doctrine. Early beliefs and later beliefs overlap, shift, and expand. This means that ancient Egypt should not be reduced to a single picture. It was a civilization with deep continuity and real change at the same time. That fact is important because history is often easier to remember when simplified, but the real ancient world was layered. What one dynasty emphasized, another might reinterpret. What one region did in one period might not be identical in another. Even burial customs evolved across centuries. Still, the basic emotional shape remained recognizable. Death had to be managed. The dead needed support. Names needed preservation. The unseen world needed order. Another detail, quietly eerie in a bedtime sense, is how many tomb spaces were designed without regular human occupation in mind. They could stay dark, dry, and silent for centuries. Once sealed, they became sealed not only in a physical sense, but in a narrative sense. They waited. Waiting can be more unsettling than decay. Something left in stillness can feel preserved, and preservation itself can be uncanny. But there is comfort inside the unease. The Egyptians believed they could prepare for what waited beyond the wall. They wrapped the body, wrote the words, sealed the chamber, and trusted the pattern. There is a kind of tenderness in making arrangements for the unknown. It says the future, however dark, deserves care. And so the strange facts become less like curiosities and more like little lanterns. A jar, a feather, a painted boat, a name, a beetle, a stone chamber. Each one catches a bit of light and holds it still. One reason ancient Egypt continues to fascinate people is that its burial customs did not disappear neatly. They left behind visible traces, copied ideas, later reinterpretations, and a persistent aura of careful strangeness. The monuments endured, the texts endured, the funerary art endured, and even the questions endured. What did they believe? How did they prepare? Why did they devote so much effort to the dead? Part of the answer is that ancient Egypt lasted a very long time. Over centuries, customs could be tested, refined, and preserved. Stability does not mean sameness, but it does mean that traditions can deepen. Another part of the answer is that the landscape itself encouraged memory. The river, the desert, the horizon, the repeated motion of flood and sun. A civilization built between fertile edges and dry expanses may naturally become attentive to continuation and survival. The tombs themselves were also teaching tools. They communicated values through scale, imagery, and arrangement. A visitor could not easily miss the emphasis on order, protection, and divine alignment. Some tomb art shows the deceased in peaceful scenes of offering and ceremony. Others show the trials of the underworld. Still others present the person in the company of gods. These are not simply pictures of what happened after death. They are visions of how to belong within a larger cosmic pattern. That belonging mattered even in the smallest household rituals. A family member bringing a bowl of water or a loaf of bread to a tomb was participating in a long chain of remembrance. The act was small, but its meaning stretched beyond the moment. There is also the fact that ancient Egyptian burial customs influenced later cultures in varied and uneven ways. Greco-Roman writers were fascinated by them. Modern archaeology turned them into objects of study. Popular imagination transformed them into symbols of deep antiquity. Sometimes that fascination distorted things, of course. The emphasis on curses, treasure, and hidden chambers can overwhelm the quieter reality of devotion, routine, and family memory. But even the distortions testify to how powerful the underlying culture remains. What persists most strongly may be the visual language, the linen wraps, the painted coffins, the amulets, the carved stone, the gold and lapis and blue glass, the stern gods and the poised animals. These images are immediately recognizable, even to people who know very little about Egyptian history. And yet the most enduring fact may not be the images themselves, but the intention behind them. To prepare carefully, to remember faithfully, to make sure that no one crossed into the dark without provisions. That concern feels timeless. Every era finds its own ways to handle loss, but the wish is the same. Let there be some continuity. Let there be some protection. Let the beloved be kept in mind. The Egyptians gave that wish extraordinary form. They set it in stone and linen. They wrote it in ink. They painted it in color that still survives in quiet chambers. Even now, when archaeologists uncover a tomb or read a funerary inscription, there is a sense of receiving a message sent very far across time. Not a loud message, a careful one. It says simply, we were here, we remembered, we tried to make the passage bearable, and that perhaps is why these facts can accompany a listener so gently at night. They are ancient, but they are not cold. They are about the oldest kind of care given to the oldest mystery of all. So the night in ancient Egypt was never only darkness. It was a place of guarded names, sealed chambers, small protective objects, and quiet faith in order. The tomb was not the end of attention. It was another form of it. There is something very human in that. To wrap, to write, to place, to speak, to return. To leave a little food, a little water, a little amulet, a little line of text. To hope that the one who has gone is still reached by these gestures. And as the hour grows softer, we can let those old customs rest where they are, in their own deep sand and shadow, in their own painted rooms and patient stone. The river keeps moving. The stars keep their places. The names remain for as long as someone remembers to say them. So settle deeper now and let the final quiet spread through the room. There is nothing more you need to hold, just the slow echo of an ancient world still keeping watch in the distance while you drift towards sleep. There is, even after all of that, still a little more to notice about the way ancient Egyptians thought about burial, because the subject does not really end at the edge of a tomb. It continues outward into the landscape, into the calendar, into the way a whole civilization learned to understand time itself. The Egyptian year was shaped by the river, by the flood and the retreat of water, by planting and harvest and the long dry intervals in between. That same rhythm of return and disappearance gave burial customs a natural place in the imagination. The body was taken from the living world into a hidden one, and yet the hidden one was never entirely separate. It was part of a repeating cycle, like night following day, like the moon disappearing and returning, like the Nile rising again after long patience. This is one reason so many burial objects seem to hold both stillness and motion at once. A scarab beetle, for example, is not only a charm, it is also a symbol of becoming, of transformation, of the sun rolling forward across the sky. The tiny object could sit quietly beside a body wrapped in linen, yet it carried with it the image of dawn. In that way, even the smallest grave goods could contain a whole cosmology. The same thing appears in the choice of colors. Blue could suggest water, heaven, protection, and the limitless expanse above the earth. Green could suggest growth and renewal. Gold suggested not only wealth, but the flesh of the gods, the shining, imperishable quality of divine existence. Even in death, the color world was speaking softly about permanence and rebirth. It is interesting, too, that so many burial items were made to be used by someone who was no longer visibly present. Cosmetics, combs, sandals, model tools, miniature food offerings, tiny chairs, amulets, vessels for oils and unguents. These things were practical in one sense and symbolic in another. They were the ordinary possessions of a person imagined in a new and quieter condition, still needing care, still needing familiarity. Some burials were modest, of course, and some were lavish. The difference mattered, but not in a simple way. A humble grave could still be spiritually complete. A rich tomb could still be unfinished in the face of eternity. The larger culture taught that proper attention mattered more than spectacle alone. A carefully written name, a correctly spoken formula, a small charm placed in the right position, these could matter as much as precious materials. And perhaps this is one of the most moving parts of Egyptian burial practice. It was a culture that understood the power of the exact gesture, not because magic was meant as theatre, but because words and actions were thought to participate in reality. A blessing was not merely symbolic. A name was not merely a label. A ritual was not merely ceremony. Each could help shape the conditions of survival beyond death. To modern readers, that may sound distant, even strange, yet it is also strangely familiar. Many people still preserve photographs, letters, locks of hair, favorite objects, small things that carry memory more reliably than explanation. The forms change, but the instinct remains gentle and recognizable. The living continue to make arrangements for the absent. They continue to believe that a trace of care can outlast a single moment. Ancient Egyptian tombs preserve those traces in especially eloquent ways. A painted banquet scene does not mean the dead are feasting in a literal modern sense. It means abundance, remembrance, inclusion, a wish for continued participation in life's gifts. A scene of offering does not merely record food, it enacts a bond between the worlds. A row of attendants, a family member with raised arms, a priest with incense, all become part of a conversation that crosses silence. Some tombs are beautifully decorated but never finished. You can still see sketches underneath the paint or lines of text where the cutting stopped abruptly. These unfinished places are oddly intimate. They remind us that burial was often an event shaped by urgency, illness, grief, timing, and the unpredictable realities of human life. Not every plan could be perfected. Not every chamber received the final polish. The dead arrived where the living could bring them, and the rest was left to the gods and the endurance of stone. There are also burials that seem to have been altered long after they were first sealed. Tombs were reopened. Coffins were reused. Names were erased and replaced. Objects were moved from one resting place to another. This was not always vandalism in the modern sense. Sometimes it was necessity. Sometimes it was reverence under difficult circumstances. Sometimes it was the practical answer to changing dynasties, shifting wealth, and the long passage of centuries. Egyptian history itself is so long that burial customs did not remain identical from one age to another. Early periods favored simpler grave goods and different body treatments. The Old Kingdom developed monumental architecture on a great scale. The Middle Kingdom refined certain coffin texts and mortuary ideas. The New Kingdom brought richly decorated tombs and elaborate elite burials in the Valley of the Kings. Later periods inherited all of this and adapted it in their own way. The result is not one single burial system, but a long conversation across time. And that conversation becomes especially quiet and interesting in the smaller details that survive. A wooden Shapti figurine with a softened face, a faience amulet with a crack still visible after thousands of years, a label tied to a mummy with the name of a person who once had relatives, property, habits, maybe even favorite meals, a basket of plant remains tucked into a burial, carrying the memory of a landscape that is now changed, a bead necklace with colors faded by dust. These things are not loud, but they are persistent. The buried dead were also imagined as living in a transformed society. Tomb scenes sometimes show servants, musicians, dancers, gardeners, and craftsmen. They are not random decorations. They reveal a hope that the afterlife would remain ordered, productive, and familiar. There would still be fields, still be boats, still be offerings, still be speech. There would still be a way to move through a world, though the world itself would no longer be the same. This is one of the reasons the Egyptian afterlife feels so richly structured. It was not merely a vague realm of shadows. It had geography, guardians, gates, names, dangers, companions, and destinations. Texts like the Book of the Dead and related funerary writings were not single books in the modern sense, but collections of spells and guidance assembled in different ways over time. They could be copied for specific individuals and placed in tombs to support the journey. Their formulas in translation can seem almost like whispered instructions for crossing a deeply unfamiliar country. There are spells for protection, spells for breathing, spells for identifying divine beings, spells for escaping snares, spells for knowing one's own name in the underworld, spells for transforming into birds or lotus flowers or divine forms. The variety itself is striking. Death was not treated as one simple threshold, but as a passage requiring many forms of readiness. And yet, for all the complexity, burial remained grounded in something very practical. Bodies had to be prepared. Wrappings had to be cut, resins had to be heated, linen had to be washed and arranged, containers had to be selected, inscriptions had to be made, offerings had to be gathered. Someone had to know what was supposed to happen and when. Much of the grandeur we now associate with ancient Egypt rested on quiet labor. The embalmers themselves occupied a peculiar position in this process. They worked with the body at a distance that was both intimate and formal. They handled flesh, oils, natron, cloth, and mask materials, yet often did so as part of a ritual system that framed their work as sacred duty. Their craft belonged to the practical world and the invisible one at the same time. This, too, is very Egyptian in character, the refusal to separate sacred meaning from technical procedure. There are depictions of embalmers and priests that remind us how ceremonial death could be. A ritual gesture over a coffin, a tool held at a precise angle, a libation poured, a mouth opened in symbolic restoration. The images are calm, almost restrained. They suggest that the dead were not abandoned to chaos, but escorted with deliberate care. The opening of the mouth ceremony deserves a little lingering attention because it is among the most evocative of the Egyptian funerary rites. It was meant to restore the senses, or at least symbolically grant the deceased the ability to eat, breathe, speak, and perceive in the afterlife. The image is quietly dramatic, a return of function, a renewal of personhood. It is an act of hope in the midst of loss, and perhaps that is why it remains so memorable to modern minds. Elsewhere, tombs preserve traces of another habit of mind, one that found comfort in duplication. Small models of boats, granaries, workshops, kitchens, and guards could accompany the dead. These were not toys in any simple sense. They were miniature worlds, reduced and portable, as though a whole life could be distilled into a manageable scale. In a tomb, a model boat might carry the deceased across celestial waters. A model bakery might continue the labor of nourishment. A model granary might promise sustained provision. Such objects show a civilization that thought carefully about continuity. If life depended on bread, then bread had to be provided in some form. If travel mattered, then travel had to continue. If labor created order, then labor had to remain available even after death. The afterlife was not imagined as pure abstraction. It retained the logic of daily existence, cleaned and adapted for eternity. Yet the Egyptians were also acutely aware that eternity was not equal to immortality in a simple, carefree sense. There was judgment, there was uncertainty, there were threats. The underworld could be guarded by serpents, walls, gates, and beings with names that had to be known correctly. The weighing of the heart scene, so famous in later tradition, expresses the idea that the soul's passage involved moral and cosmic balance. A person's life could be tested against Mart, the principle of truth, order, and rightness. Mart is one of those concepts that becomes clearer the more one sits with it quietly. It was not merely law, not merely justice, not merely truth. It was the balanced condition that let the world continue without falling apart. The pharaoh was expected to uphold it. Priests participated in it. Families lived within it. Even burial practices, with their emphasis on exactness and preservation, were expressions of Mart in tangible form. To place a body correctly was to affirm order. To name a deceased person properly was to resist erasure. To offer food was to acknowledge relational responsibility. To seal a tomb was to respect boundaries. To inscribe a spell was to let language stabilize the unknown. The burial chamber became a small, defended model of the world as it should be. And because Egypt was so closely tied to long-lived religious traditions, some of its burial practices remained recognizable for astonishing spans of time. A motif could appear, disappear, and reappear. A god could be worshipped in one city and adopted differently in another. A coffin style could evolve while preserving old symbols. In this way, the burial record is also a record of memory itself. Civilization did not merely progress forward. It revisited earlier forms, reinterpreted them, and kept old meanings alive in new materials. Sometimes the tomb itself became the message. The sheer effort of carving into bedrock, transporting stone, or raising a mastaba above the sand declared that the dead person mattered. Tombs along the Nile could stand in orderly rows or hide within cliffs. Their placement was not accidental. They faced the sun, the river, the horizon, or the sacred geography of a necropolis. The landscape around them was part of the funerary language. The necropolis of the West, where the sun set, carried particular resonance. The dead were associated with the western horizon because the sun appeared to die there each evening, only to be reborn in the morning. This simple daily event became a vast spiritual template. The sunset was not only beautiful, it was instructive. It suggested a passage from visible presence into hidden renewal. That is perhaps why so many tomb scenes are colored with warm earth tones, deep blues, and luminous accents. They suggest both dusk and continuity. The spaces are enclosed but not dead. They are full of doors, thresholds, corridors, and chambers. You move through them in the mind the way one moves through a dream, aware that every room has a purpose, every inscription a function, every painted eye a watchfulness. The painted eyes on coffins are especially memorable. They often appear on the sides of anthropoid coffins, as if the deceased were meant to look out from the resting place. The effect is both practical and symbolic. The coffin becomes not only a container but a face. The body is enclosed, but the person is still in some sense present. It is a beautiful and slightly uncanny idea, one that belongs very naturally to a civilization that treated the dead as ongoing participants in social and sacred life. Some coffins and sarcophagi were richly inscribed with names, prayers, and scenes of divine protection. Others were simpler but still carefully designed. A coffin might display the sky goddess Nut arching protectively over the occupant, her body covering the lid like a celestial canopy. In that image, burial becomes cosmic shelter. The tomb is no longer merely a room underground. It is a miniature universe under the guard of a goddess. The sky itself then becomes part of the burial ritual. The stars mattered, the constellations mattered, the orientation of the tomb mattered. Even the placement of the body could reflect ideas about celestial travel. Ancient Egyptians watched the heavens with the kind of steady attention that comes from long dependence on natural cycles. The dead, in many traditions, were imagined among the stars or aligned with divine regions of the sky. This makes the burial landscape feel larger than one religion or one dynasty. It becomes a place where earth and heaven meet quietly, through architecture and text and ritual. The tomb is a door but also a map. The mummy is a body but also a symbolic transformation. The offerings are food but also a continued relationship. The spell is language but also a protective act. Even the tools of archaeology in later centuries have encountered these tombs with a kind of reverent curiosity. Excavators brush away sand grain by grain, conservators stabilize fragile surfaces, Egyptologists translate inscriptions line by line, museum curators work to preserve objects that were never meant to be separated from their companions. Modern science has added imaging, chemical analysis, CT scans, and careful documentation, letting researchers see beneath wrappings without entirely unmaking them. And still, despite all of that, some mysteries remain. We still do not know every detail of every burial practice in every period. We do not understand all the local variations, all the lost ceremonies, all the family stories embedded in objects that now sit behind glass. Some tombs were robbed long ago. Some burials were disturbed by later construction. Some names were lost to water, heat, or neglect. The ancient silence is not fully recoverable. That too is part of the atmosphere. There is a strange tenderness in this incompleteness. A broken coffin lid can still be beautiful. A faded hieroglyph can still be read. A damaged amulet can still suggest hope. Even a fragment of linen wrapped around a bone can tell a story about hands that worked carefully under pressure from time. Many burials also show evidence of the body's long relationship with the desert environment. Egypt's dryness could preserve organic material that would not survive in wetter climates. This is one reason textile fragments, plant remains, wood, and papyrus sometimes endure so remarkably. The climate itself participates in the preservation of memory. Sand covers, dries, and shelters. It also erases, of course. It hides and reveals in the same slow breath. The desert around the Nile can feel almost geological in its patience. A tomb entrance can disappear under drifting sand for centuries. A chamber can remain sealed while whole kingdoms rise and fall. Then, with a little clearing, a doorway appears again, and with it the thoughts of people who have been absent for more than 2 millennia. It is one of the quiet miracles of archaeology, and one of the reasons Egyptian burial sites continue to feel so charged with presence. One can imagine the ancient workers who cut these spaces into rock, carried in their tools, lit their oil lamps, spoke to one another softly, and perhaps never intended to be remembered individually. Yet even without names, they remain part of the story. Burial culture was collective. The noble tomb and the workman's labor, the priest's chant and the mason's chisel, all belong to the same long system of care. At Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb workers near the Valley of the Kings, the everyday life of artisans has come into unusually clear view. There were work schedules, family disputes, wages in grain, personal devotion, letters, and small domestic rituals. These people were not abstract agents of empire. They had households, friendships, frustrations, and private hopes. They were involved in making one of the world's most elaborate funerary landscapes, and their own burials, when discovered, also tell us about how ordinary people approached death. That ordinary dimension matters deeply. Ancient Egypt is often remembered through royal burial, but most Egyptians did not receive monumental tombs. They still had beliefs about the afterlife. They still used amulets and prayers. They still hoped for protection and remembrance. Their grave may be smaller, but the underlying desire is the same. Even a modest burial can say, "Let the journey be safe." The continuity between elite and non-elite practice is one reason the study of burial is so revealing. It opens a view onto both state ideology and household devotion. It shows how theology entered daily life, not only in temples but in family cemeteries, in simple coffins, in children's grave, in offerings left by relatives who could not afford much but could still care very deeply. Children's burials are particularly poignant. Small coffins, miniature amulets, tiny vessels, simple wrappings. They remind us that Egyptian death customs were not only about kings and queens, but about the vulnerability of all ages. The grief surrounding a child's death must have been immense, and the burial treatment reflects a desire to protect what could no longer be protected in life. Even here, the language of care remains gentle and determined. The dead could also be commemorated in stelae and inscriptions outside the tomb itself. Visitors would read names and offer prayers. Family members might return on festival days. Some tombs were designed to support repeated visitation, as if the boundary between living and dead was not fixed but managed through ritual return. A tomb could become a place of ongoing relationship rather than final separation. This is one of the loveliest aspects of ancient Egyptian burial thought. It does not treat remembrance as incidental. Remembrance is part of survival. To speak the name, to bring an offering, to inscribe a formula, to place a flower or a bowl of water, these are not empty habits. They sustain continuity. They help the deceased remain integrated into the moral and spiritual world. And because the Egyptians took names seriously, the loss of a name could be understood as a severe threat. To be remembered was to exist in an important sense. To be unnamed was to drift toward obscurity. This is why names were carved carefully and why some were erased deliberately in political or religious conflict. The fate of a name could become entangled with power, memory, and legitimacy. Still, even erasure is a kind of evidence. When a cartouche is chiseled away, we learn something about the tensions of the time. When a tomb is reused, we learn about scarcity or changing custom. When a burial is moved, we learn about reverence under pressure. The dead continue to speak through the disruptions that touch them. There are famous royal examples, of course, but also countless anonymous ones. Tomb robbers, later priests, renovators, and archaeologists all left their marks. Ancient Egypt's burial landscape is therefore layered not only with funerary intention, but with centuries of revisitation. It is a palimpsest of grief, devotion, greed, study, and conservation. Every layer changes the meaning slightly. Every layer adds a new silence, yet the central impulse still remains visible. The person must not be lost all at once. Something must accompany them. Something must remain near them. Something must tell the darkness that this life mattered. It is worth pausing over how the ancient Egyptians imagined the body itself, because burial was deeply tied to bodily integrity. The body was not a disposable shell. It was part of identity, part of continuity, part of the conditions for afterlife existence. That is why mutilation, decomposition, and dismemberment carried such spiritual danger in many contexts. Preservation became an act of metaphysical maintenance. Mummification, in this light, was not only a practical response to decay, it was a theology of preservation made physical. Wrapping, drying, anointing, sealing, and adorning the body all served the larger effort of keeping identity intact. The mummy is so visually distinctive that it can feel almost unreal to modern viewers, yet for the Egyptians it was one answer to a profound question: how can a person remain a person after death? Different periods and different people answered that question in different ways. Some emphasized bodily preservation. Others focused more on the ka, the ba, the name, or the continuation of ritual offerings. In later times, burial customs interacted with new religious movements and foreign rule, producing combinations that are especially interesting to historians. Egyptian burial culture was never frozen. It adapted, absorbed, and endured. In the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, for instance, one finds Egyptian forms coexisting with Hellenistic influences. Portrait-style mummy masks from Fayum offer faces that feel startlingly immediate. They are both Egyptian and something slightly different, shaped by a broader Mediterranean world. Even here, the dead are held between tradition and change, between ancient custom and evolving identity. This blending of forms is a reminder that burial is always both personal and political. It reflects belief, but also social organization, trade, craft, administration, and the spread of materials. Oils had to be imported or produced, linen had to be woven, wood had to be sourced, stone had to be quarried, artisans had to train, priests had to officiate. A funeral is not only a family event, it is also a civic and economic one. At the same time, the tomb could become a place of deep privacy. Once sealed, it belonged to the dead and to the unseen. Hidden chambers, false doors, concealed shafts, and protected burial apartments all reveal a desire to keep the resting place secure. The secrecy was not merely about treasure, though treasure certainly attracted attention in later centuries. It was also about sanctity. The dead needed a protected environment in which to continue their existence undisturbed. That desire for protection gives Egyptian burial spaces their particular atmosphere. They are not simply stores of wealth, nor only archaeological sites. They are chambers of intention. Each layer of architecture, each inscription, each layer of plaster, each painted scene contributes to a feeling that someone once wanted the world to pause here, to keep watch here, to hold the boundary. And perhaps because that boundary was so carefully maintained, the discovery of a tomb can still feel emotionally charged in a quiet way. The room has not been meant for living footsteps in a very long time. Dust covers the floor, the air is still. The walls preserve scenes made for the eyes of gods and the dead. Standing there, one becomes aware of the extraordinary distance between the present moment and the people who arranged these things. Yet the distance is crossed by details: a bead, a feather motif, a ritual text, a trace of coal around a painted eye, a funeral wreath pressed flat by centuries, a fragment of wood that once held a lid, a cup left at the threshold. These are small bridges. They allow thought to move gently from one age to another. Sometimes in this way, ancient Egypt feels less like a vanished civilization and more like a long, partially open room. We cannot enter it completely, but we can stand near the doorway and notice the arrangement within. We can see how the furniture of belief was set, how the lamps were tended, how the doors were closed. We can admire the patience of the builders and the persistence of the mourners. There is no need to rush through such a room. It is best approached slowly, almost in silence, with enough time for the eye to adjust. The inscriptions become clearer. The colors emerge. The symbolic animals appear. The names take shape. Even the emptiness inside a tomb begins to feel meaningful because it has been prepared to receive absence. This may be the deepest, quiet fact of all. Burial is one of the ways human beings make a place for absence without surrendering to it entirely. Ancient Egypt understood this with remarkable clarity. The dead were gone, but not simply gone. They were elsewhere and yet still reachable. They required shelter, language, ritual, memory, and care. They were separated but not forgotten. The same idea appears in a softer form in many household customs today. A chair kept unoccupied, a photograph placed on a shelf, a favorite dish prepared on an anniversary, a name spoken with tenderness. The forms are smaller now, often private and unadorned, but they belong to the same family of gestures. Human beings continue to build small sanctuaries for memory. And so, when we look back toward ancient Egyptian burial practices, we are not only studying an extinct world, we are also seeing one of the earliest and most elaborate expressions of a very enduring human truth. Love does not want to vanish without making arrangements. Grief does not want to be careless. Hope does not want to be silent. Even at the edge of the grave, people reach for order, beauty, and protection. The Egyptian answer was monumental and intimate at once. Stone that could endure, linen that could embrace, text that could guide, amulets that could guard, paint that could speak, offerings that could continue. It was all meant to say in material form that death had boundaries and that the person inside those boundaries still mattered. Perhaps that is why these burial customs remain so compelling after so many centuries. They are not only strange, they are carefully strange. They reveal a civilization thinking with unusual seriousness about the darkest transition in human life, and then answering it with precision, artistry, and devotion. There is a final quietness in the way so many of these artifacts survive. A coffin lid survives because it was placed in a dry chamber. A papyrus survives because it was protected from damp. A painted wall survives because the room remained sealed. A mummy survives because someone once believed preservation mattered. The archaeology of Egypt is therefore also an archaeology of intention preserved by climate. And as the night deepens, that thought can soften into something almost like a lullaby. Everything fragile, if given enough care, can endure a little longer. A name, a vessel, a line of ink, a folded cloth, a remembered ritual, a resting place under the sand. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough to be found again. Long enough for someone, many centuries later, to stand quietly beside it and feel the presence of another mind across time. Long enough for the old world to whisper its calm instruction. Prepare carefully, remember faithfully, and do not let the beloved go unheld. So let the burial chambers remain in their stillness. Let the desert keep its silence. Let the painted gods watch over the sealed rooms, and let the river continue its patient journey past the ruins of temples and the buried edges of forgotten towns. The stars are still there above the sand. The names still remain in their stone. The old customs, though distant, are not entirely gone. And now there is nothing left to solve, nothing left to arrange. Only the gentle recognition that ancient people, too, laid down their fears in the dark and asked for protection against forgetting. The room grows softer, the thoughts grow slower. The long path through Egypt's burial world comes to rest without hurry. Sleep can take its time now. The sand is warm in memory, the tombs are quiet, and the old guardians stand watch while you drift, calm and unburdened, into the deep and peaceful night. Yet there is still more to notice, if only in the dim and patient way one might notice shadows on a wall at dusk. Ancient Egyptian burial customs were never a single fixed thing. They changed gradually over many centuries, and that long change is part of their quiet fascination. The Old Kingdom did not bury the dead in exactly the same manner as the New Kingdom. Kings were treated differently from nobles, and nobles differently from ordinary people, and even ordinary people could sometimes borrow sacred forms that once belonged only to royalty. The afterlife, in other words, was not a single road. It was a landscape with paths opening and closing over time. In the earliest royal burials, the tomb itself was often the chief statement. Massive mastabas and later the Great Pyramids asserted permanence through shape and scale. They were not merely containers for the dead. They were monuments to continuity, to rule, to the idea that a king's identity extended beyond a single body. Over time, however, the focus shifted more openly toward texts, objects, and magical instructions. The body still mattered, the tomb still mattered. But the words placed inside the burial became more elaborate, and the unseen journey beyond death began to be described in greater detail. The pyramid texts are among the oldest religious writings known from Egypt. Their lines are ancient enough to feel almost like a voice arriving from before history had fully settled into memory. They were carved inside royal pyramids and addressed the dead king with a mix of power, warning, assurance, and transformation. Later, the coffin texts extended similar ideas to a wider circle of the dead, written on wooden coffins rather than stone walls. Still later came the Book of the Dead, a modern name for a much older and more varied collection of spells, hymns, and guidance intended to help the deceased negotiate the next world. These texts are not simply funerary literature, they are maps of a hoped-for survival. What is especially interesting is how practical they can seem, despite their sacred tone. They speak of gates, guardians, names, transformations, and obstacles. They often present the afterlife not as an abstract cloud of immortality, but as a place one must navigate with knowledge. In that sense, burial texts were companions for the dead, but also technologies of reassurance for the living. To write down a spell was to create a kind of portable certainty. To place a word in a tomb was to believe that language could travel where the body could not. Some burial objects carried those assurances in smaller and quieter ways. Scarabs, for example, were not only decorative, they were linked with rebirth, daily renewal, and the sun's movement across the sky. A tiny amulet in the shape of a beetle could stand beside a great sarcophagus and still belong to the same spiritual order. The beetle rolling its ball through the dust may have suggested, to careful observers, the sun moving through darkness and emerging again. Egyptian symbolism often works like this. A large cosmic truth appears in a very ordinary sight. A bird, a river, a flower, a mound of earth, an insect crossing sand. The natural world becomes a long, quiet vocabulary for divine things. The heart scarab is especially tender in its purpose. It was intended to protect the heart in the afterlife, and the heart itself was treated as the seat of memory, conscience, and identity. Many people today might imagine the brain as the center of thought, but ancient Egyptian burial customs make clear that the heart carried a deeper moral weight. In some contexts, the heart was left in the body while the brain was removed and discarded because the heart would be needed for judgment. This judgment was not presented as cruel, but as ordered and exact. The deceased would come before divine evaluation, and the heart would be weighed against truth, often represented by the feather of Maat, the principle of balance, justice, and rightness. This image is one of the most delicate in the whole tradition. A heart so easily imagined as a private and emotional thing resting on a scale beside a feather, the scene feels both solemn and strangely gentle. It suggests that a life was measured not by wealth alone or by power alone, but by alignment with a larger harmony. The deceased was not only to be buried well, the deceased was to be ethically prepared. Burial then was not just about preservation, it was about accountability. A tomb could shelter the body, but the soul still had to answer for itself. And yet the Egyptians were not absorbed only by severity. They loved color, and their burial world was often brightly inhabited. Painted tomb scenes show fish in the water, people bringing offerings, gardens, boats, musicians, workshop scenes, and processions of cattle or servants. These are not gloomy images. Even in the realm of the dead, life is described through activity, abundance, and pattern. Perhaps that is one reason Egyptian burial art feels so alive to modern viewers. It is not trying to erase the world, it is trying to continue it in a protected form. The tomb walls themselves sometimes became a quiet theatre of memory. A person's daily work might be shown there as a way of sustaining it. A field might be painted so grain would continue to grow. A banquet might be depicted so food would perpetually be available. A boat might be drawn so the deceased might travel. The logic is at once magical and practical, and because it is so consistent, it can begin to feel almost calm in its own way. Everything necessary should be remembered. Everything remembered should be made stable. The tomb was a place where the randomness of loss was resisted through arrangement. Ancient Egyptians also paid close attention to names. A name was not a simple label. It was a vessel of identity, and to preserve a name was to preserve the person in a form accessible to the living and the gods. That is why inscriptions matter so much. That is why defacement could be such a profound act. To erase a name was to threaten continuity. To write a name carefully was to help the dead remain. There is something very human in this, something not limited to Egypt. We still feel the importance of names on stones, plaques, memorials, family records, and letters kept in drawers. To be named is to be remembered in a way that feels tangible. To be read aloud after death is a small victory against disappearance. Some royal burials contain extraordinary evidence of planning. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, the objects were crowded in ways that suggest haste, adaptation, and perhaps the repurposing of materials from other burials. The famous tomb is not the richest ever found, but it became the most famous because it remained relatively intact. That intactness gave later generations a rare glimpse into the material layering of a royal burial. There were nested coffins, protective shrines, jewelry, ceremonial items, furniture, food offerings, chariots, perfumes, and many smaller objects whose original placement still invites careful study. The tomb feels almost like a sealed room where a life was set down in fragments, each one chosen to matter. The golden mask of Tutankhamun has become perhaps the best-known image from ancient Egypt, but its fame can obscure something quieter and more human. The boy king died young. His burial was meant to transform a brief life into a lasting sacred presence. The objects around him were not only signs of wealth, they were signs of concern. Someone arranged them, someone wrapped him, someone decided what should accompany him. Even in a royal tomb, the human hand is everywhere. And perhaps that is what makes the whole tradition feel so intimate beneath its grandeur. Monumental stone often conceals a series of small, careful acts performed by living people on behalf of the dead. Those acts could be laborious. Mummification, in its more elaborate form, required time, skill, and a complex sequence of treatments. The body was cleaned, dried, wrapped, and prepared with attention to each limb and feature. Natron helped remove moisture. Resins and oils may have been applied. Linen wrappings encased the body, and amulets were placed between layers. The face was sometimes covered with a mask or painted shroud. What emerges from this process is not a simple preserved corpse, but a transformed body made suitable for another mode of existence. It is easy to think of mummification only as an attempt to cheat death, but that is perhaps too blunt. It was also a form of respect. To care for the body was to continue caring for the person. The body was not treated as disposable. Even when altered, it was treated as still belonging to someone. In a world without modern embalming and preservation systems, the Egyptians developed a highly refined method of protecting identity through matter. The dead were not left to anonymous decay if it could be helped. They were prepared to endure, and yet not every burial was royal, and not every Egyptian had access to such expensive rites. Many ordinary burials were simpler, though still meaningful. Bodies were placed in sand, in coffins, in modest grave, sometimes with amulets or small offerings. In some places and periods, natural desiccation may have preserved bodies before artificial mummification became more elaborate. The dry climate itself was an ally of memory. The desert, which could seem barren to the living, became a surprising conservator of the dead. It is one of those ancient ironies that the landscape of apparent emptiness helped keep so much alive. Small burials can be just as moving as grand ones. A clay pot, a cheap bead, a little vessel of oil, a bread loaf, a figurine. These are not spectacular objects, but they carry the same instinct. The dead should not go entirely unprovided for. The next world, if it existed, should not begin in want. Even the humblest grave could become a site of careful hope. In this way, ancient Egyptian burial practice was not only the domain of kings and priests, but of families and neighborhoods and local traditions. Death touched everyone, and so everyone found some version of ritual response. There were also many regional and temporal variations that remind us not to flatten Egypt into a single image. The Delta and Upper Egypt had different local histories. The long timeline of pharaonic civilization saw changes in burial architecture, theology, and artistic style. Foreign rule introduced additional layers. Local cults persisted beside state religion. The burial landscape was therefore a patient accumulation rather than a fixed pattern. This accumulation is one reason Egypt feels so ancient in the deepest sense. It did not just exist for a long time. It preserved traces of its own long transformations. Some of the most fascinating burial objects are the most quietly technical. Canopic jars, for instance, were used in various periods to hold organs removed during mummification. They were often protected by the 4 sons of Horus, each associated with a particular organ and guardian role. These jars may appear simple at first glance, yet they are part of a whole system of bodily care and divine symbolism. They suggest a worldview in which even discarded parts of the body were not meaningless. Everything had a place. Everything had a relation. The dead were assembled, not merely abandoned. The same can be said of Shapti figures, those small servants placed in tombs to perform work for the deceased in the afterlife. They are often humble-looking, made in rows, carrying tools or inscribed with spells. At first they may seem almost quaint, but they belong to a very old and practical dream, that one need not labor forever without assistance. The afterlife, too, was imagined as a realm with obligations. The Shaptis stood ready to answer. In a way, they are among the kindest objects in the burial tradition. tiny workers waiting silently in the dark so that the dead might rest. The tomb of a wealthy person could contain a whole miniature world: boats for travel, furniture for sitting, cosmetics for adornment, writing equipment for continuation of the intellect, games for leisure, food for sustenance, weapons for protection in some contexts, though the emphasis is often more ceremonial than martial. The arrangement of objects could become almost domestic, as if the tomb were a house paused in mid-use. That domestic quality is poignant. It suggests that death was not imagined only as a threshold into an abstract realm, but as a continuation of familiar conditions in transfigured form. Even the architecture of tombs reflects this blend of solidity and transition. Corridors descend, chambers open, false doors invite symbolic passage, niches hold offerings, shafts conceal burials, walls carry prayers. The tomb is both enclosure and invitation. It closes the dead away from danger, yet it also gives them a route to the divine. The silence of the chamber is therefore not empty silence. It is curated silence, built silence, silence that has been shaped for a purpose. One of the great quiet wonders of Egyptian burial culture is that it linked the finite and the eternal without seeming embarrassed by either. The body is temporary, yet it deserves care. The grave is sealed, yet the dead can receive offerings. The soul departs, yet it may return. The sun sets, yet it rises. The Nile floods and recedes. Grain dies and grows again. A funerary system built on such observations naturally became rich with repetition and renewal. It is almost as if the Egyptians looked at the world and saw everywhere that endings were rarely pure endings. This may help explain why many burial symbols center on rebirth. The scarab, the lotus, the sun disk, the dawn, the eastern horizon, the rising riverbank, the mummiform shape resembling both wrapped body and sacred seed. These images are never far apart. The dead were not only to persist, they were to be renewed in some transformed way. The tomb could resemble a seedbed in the earth, and the corpse could resemble a sleeping form awaiting awakening. Such imagery has a peaceful quality, especially when compared with more violent conceptions of death in other traditions. It allows the finality of death to be approached indirectly through the language of return. Of course, there were fears as well. Tomb robbery was one of the oldest and most practical anxieties in Egypt. The elaborate protection of burials, the curses, the hidden chambers, the false passages, the sealing stones, and the magical texts all testify to a persistent worry that the dead might be disturbed. This was not an abstract superstition. It was a real social problem. Tombs contained valuables, and valuables attracted thieves. But the robbery of a tomb was more than theft. It was a disruption of the dead person's carefully arranged afterlife. To open a burial improperly was to risk disturbing a whole sacred order. The calm surfaces of tombs conceal this underlying tension. Even so, some tombs were built with astonishing patience. The great royal projects required armies of workers, coordinated transport, quarrying, carving, painting, and provisioning. Yet the result was meant to look timeless, as if the desert had simply produced a permanent form. The pyramid especially has a stillness that can feel almost geological. It seems less built than discovered, and that may be part of its enduring power. It does not move the eye quickly. It settles into the landscape like a thought that has become stone. The same is true of many temple tomb complexes, where ritual and burial met in one broader sacred environment. Temples were for the living, but also for the divine and the dead. Offerings moved through these spaces in a continuous rhythm. Priests maintained cult statues. Families visited memorial chapels. In some cases, the boundary between temple and tomb could feel porous. The dead king might be honored as a god. The god might be present in the upkeep of the king's name. Egypt loved these continuities. It was a civilization of connected rooms. There is also a gentle mystery in the way many burial beliefs survive only in fragments. We know so much, and yet the full texture of ancient feeling remains partly hidden. We can study texts, unwrap mummies, map tombs, read inscriptions, and examine residues in vessels. But the private sensation of standing at a burial beside a loved one 2,000 or 3,000 years ago cannot be recovered in full. We can only infer it from traces. This is perhaps appropriate. A little mystery belongs to the dead. It preserves their distance. It keeps the past from becoming too easy. Still, certain details make them feel nearer. A child's burial with toys, a perfumed cone at a banquet scene, a painted bouquet, a linen inscription naming a woman, a simple grave marker in the desert. Such details are small and quiet, but they cross the centuries with unusual grace. They remind us that ancient Egypt was not only pyramids and pharaohs, it was households, gestures, inventories, prayers, and the persistent human urge to make loss more bearable. When funerary objects are displayed today in museums, they often appear under bright modern lights, separated from their original darkness. In that setting, their purpose can seem oddly delicate. A coffin lid becomes an artwork, a jar becomes an artifact, an amulet becomes a tiny image behind glass, and yet, even removed from tomb and sand, these objects continue to perform a kind of memory. They still speak of the people who once expected them to function as companions. There is a hush around them if one is willing to hear it. The quietest fact of all may be this: ancient Egyptian burial customs were not only about death, they were about the refusal to let death be the only story. The body was wrapped because the body mattered. The name was written because the name mattered. The food was offered because continuity mattered. The words were spoken because silence alone was not enough. Every layer of burial practice says that loss needed answering. Not denied, not conquered, but answered with attention. And so the long centuries of Egyptian funerary thought remain surprisingly tender. Beneath the gold and granite, beneath the ritual complexity and the sacred formulas, there is a simple human posture. Someone careful over someone else who can no longer care for themselves. A son, a priest, a wife, a servant, an embalmer, a scribe, a community, each contributing a part of the long, structured farewell. In that sense, burial was not a single act but a shared endurance. Even the gods in Egyptian mythology seem to understand this layered tenderness. Osiris, ruler of the dead, is not a remote abstraction but a figure marked by dismemberment, restoration, and kingship. Isis gathers what has been lost. Anubis guards the dead and attends the mummification process. Thoth records and measures. Hathor receives the deceased in some traditions with maternal gentleness. These divine roles are not distant from burial practice. They are its mythic counterpart. The gods make cosmological sense of what human hands are already doing carefully on the ground. Perhaps that is why the burial world of Egypt continues to feel so absorbing. It joins the practical and the sacred without apology. It treats the dead as fragile matter and enduring presence at once. It imagines preservation not as a denial of change, but as a bridge through it. And it does all this with a strange combination of exactness and dreamlike atmosphere. The desert chambers, the sealed doors, the painted stars, the folded linen, the copper tools, the sweet resin, the whispered names. It is a civilization of thresholds. If one lingers with it long enough, the sense of strangeness can soften into companionship. These are not only remote rituals, they are ancient versions of our own gestures toward remembrance. We keep photographs, we protect heirlooms, we visit grave, we speak names into rooms no one else can hear, we arrange flowers, we save letters, we preserve the smallest traces because disappearance feels too complete otherwise. The Egyptians did these things on a grand and sacred scale, but the impulse is recognizable. And so the burial chambers recede once more into their perfect stillness. The amulets rest where they were placed. The texts remain in their scripts of comfort and command. The canopic jars keep their quiet watch. The shabtis stand in their patient rows. The painted offerings remain offered in the slow logic of ritual time. Everything is where it was intended to be, and that intention itself becomes a kind of shelter. The desert outside is wide and nearly motionless. The river continues dark and steady through the long corridor of history. Somewhere far away, a scribe has set down his reed pen. Somewhere a name has been spoken softly and then preserved in stone. Somewhere a lamp has gone out. Somewhere a tomb has been sealed. And above it all, the night sky keeps its ancient arrangement of stars as it has for so long. You may let your thoughts grow lighter now, like dust settling after a footstep. There is no need to search further. No need to open the chamber again. The old world has already offered what it could, its care, its symbols, its measured awe. It has shown that even in burial people sought gentleness. Even in darkness they made patterns. Even in loss they built places for memory to live. And so the final feeling is not one of ending, but of careful resting. A linen-wrapped quiet, a sealed and protective hush, a warm chamber beneath the sand, undisturbed and complete. Let the ancient names remain in their places. Let the river keep moving. Let the stars stand over the desert. Let the body sleep and the soul journey and the living remember. Now the room can grow very still. The long, curious walk through Egypt's burial customs has come to a softer pause. There is only the slow breath of the night, the far-off hush of history, and the reassuring thought that what was cherished was not truly abandoned. It was placed with care. It was spoken over. It was guarded. It was remembered. And in that remembering, even now it remains.